In today's vlog, I'm going to rebuild the top end on my 2018 KTM 250SX. And if you're using this video to kind of follow along and learn how to rebuild the top end on your own bike, don't worry if your bike isn't the same make, model, or year as mine, as all two-stroke engines are pretty similar, and so you can still apply all these same principles to your own bike. The first step to working on your engine should be cleaning your dirt bike. Now, I did clean my bike and got rid of all the loose debris, but I did not scrub and detail everything as I didn't have a whole lot of time. So, ideally you should give your bike a deep cleaning if it needs it before you start work on the engine. And where I didn't, I just had to be a lot more cautious not to let any grains of sand fall into the engine. You can just see the keyboard warriors lining up now. It's gonna be bad. The parts that I used in this top end rebuild was a KTM Stage 2 OEM complete piston, Tusk top end gasket kit, and an OEM needle bearing. The tools that I used was a 13mm socket, 8mm socket, 6mm socket, 2 torque bits, a pick, a spring puller, torque wrench, rubber mallet, and blue Loctite. I start with removing the seat. And for anyone wondering how I like to keep track of which bolts go where, I simply screw them back in once the part has been removed. And for the bolts that have to stay out for the part to be removed, I either set in trays or in a Ziploc bag. Next, I remove the gas tank and shrouds. I like to leave the shrouds mounted to the gas tank just to speed up the process. Next, I remove the silencer and the pipe. Before I go any further, I like to remove the spark plug just to get it out of the way. Start with draining the coolant. Place a bucket underneath the drain bolt, remove the bolt, and then remove the radiator cap and the coolant will drain out. Then, start removing the hoses by loosening the clamps, pushing and pulling to break the seal, and then push and pull until the hose is removed. I find it easiest to push down on the hose where it meets the radiator mount, opposed to pulling backwards on the hose. Start by removing the engine braces. Then, remove the cylinder head bolts in a crisscross pattern. If you have to, gently tap upwards with a rubber mallet until the cylinder head is off. In order to remove the cylinder, you will need to remove these covers to access the bolts. On the right side, you will need to remove the connecting rod. There is a small clip you will need to remove. Make sure you use a towel or anything to cover the hole so that you don't drop the clip in the bottom end. Once the clip is removed, you can then pull the connecting rod off the ball joint. Loosen the bolts again in a crisscross pattern. Once the bolts are removed, you can gently lift the cylinder off of the piston. It is a good idea to take a clean rag and stuff it around the piston so that no debris can fall into the bottom end, and then remove the gasket. Next, use a pick to remove the circlip. Then gently tap the piston pin out. Ideally, do it a little bit more gentle than that. Then lastly, remove the needle bearing. Carefully inspect the cylinder for scratches and clean the cylinder and cylinder head as well as you can. Apply a little bit of engine oil to the needle bearing, then place it in the rod. Next, put just one circlip in the piston. These can sometimes be a little difficult, so be patient. I find that applying a little bit of engine oil into the groove where the ring will be sliding in, and then using the corner of a socket to push it in being the easiest method. And if you do end up lightly scratching the piston in the process, you can use a file to gently file down the rough edges. Next, set the piston on the rod, with the arrow at the top pointing forwards. Apply oil to the piston pin, and then slide it in. Then install the other circlip. Unfortunately, I missed the shot of me doing so. Then, install the new gasket. That is the same thickness as your old gasket. Rub engine oil on the piston and cylinder so that things will slide together with ease and no damage. There are 2 pins at the rear of the piston, so pinch the rings together so that the ends of the rings are touching the pins, and then gently slide the cylinder over the piston. Sometimes it can be a little tricky, so be patient. Once the cylinder is on, check to make sure the piston moves freely and smooth by compressing the kickstart. Tighten down the stud nuts for the cylinder in a crisscross pattern. The torque spec for these bolts is 35 Newton meters. You won't be able to get a torque wrench on the front stud nuts, so you'll have to tighten these by feel. Install the new gasket. Apply a little bit of Loctite on the bolts. These bolts have a torque spec of 4 Newton meters, but I usually just go off of feel and I'm careful to not over tighten them. On the right side, you will need to push the connecting rod back onto the ball joint and reinstall the little clip. Place the new O-rings in the grooves. They like to pop out of place, so I found that rubbing just a little bit of grease around these rings helps them stick into place a little better. Then, install the new copper washers on the bolts. Set the head back into position, making sure everything is lined up, and install the bolts in a crisscross pattern. And the torque spec on these bolts is 27 Newton meters. Reinstall all the hoses you removed back to where they go, and tighten the clamps down. And just so I don't forget, as soon as they are all installed, I make sure to fill the radiator full of coolant again. And while I'm in that area, install the spark plug and engine braces. I use a medium strength Loctite on the engine brace bolts and torque them down to 35 Newton meters. And then lastly, all you need to do is reinstall the pipe, silencer, gas tank, shrouds, and seat. And that's pretty much it for rebuilding the top end on a 2-stroke. It's a pretty simple process, and I did do it in a pretty simple way as I was replacing stock parts with stock parts, but you can definitely use certain tools to take a lot more measurements as you go along, which I would recommend if you were, say, replacing stock parts with aftermarket parts, then it definitely does help to take extra measurements. But I've never really made a mechanical type video before, so I figured this would be kind of a fun little learning experiment, so hopefully you enjoyed.